Okay, 11 June 2025, dis and dat information. We're going to do in preparation for the Thursday, the People's Forum course, they an audio from the audio book, sections or chapters 7 through 10 of Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism.
Imperialism as a special stage of capitalism. We must now try to sum up, to draw together the threads of what has been said above on the subject of imperialism. Imperialism emerged as the development and direct continuation of the fundamental characteristics of capitalism in general. But capitalism only became capitalist imperialism at a definite and very high stage of its development, when certain of its fundamental characteristics began to change into their opposites, when the features of the epoch of transition from capitalism to a higher social and economic system had taken shape and revealed themselves in all spheres. Economically, the main thing in this process is the displacement of capitalist free competition by capitalist monopoly. Free competition is the basic feature of capitalism and of commodity production generally. Monopoly is the exact opposite of free competition, but we have seen the latter being transformed into monopoly before our eyes, creating large-scale industry and forcing out small industry, replacing large-scale by still larger-scale industry, and carrying out concentration of production and capital to the point where out of it has grown and is growing monopoly. Cartels, syndicates, and trusts, and merging with them, the capital of a dozen or so banks, which manipulate thousands of millions. At the same time, the monopolies, which have grown out of free competition, do not eliminate the latter, but exist above it and alongside it, and thereby give rise to a number of acute, intense antagonisms, frictions, and conflicts. Monopoly is the transition from capitalism to a higher system. If it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. Such a definition would include what is most important, for, on the one hand, finance capital is the bank capital of a few very big monopolist banks, merged with the capital of monopolist associations of industrialists, and, on the other hand, the division of the world is the transition from a colonial policy which has extended without hindrance to territories unseized by any capitalist power, to a colonial policy of monopolist possession of the territory of the world which has been completely divided up. But very brief definitions, although convenient, for they sum up the main points, are nevertheless inadequate, since we have to deduce from them some especially important features of the phenomenon that has to be defined. And so, without forgetting the conditional and relative value of all definitions in general, which can never embrace all the concatenations of a phenomenon in its full development, we must give a definition of imperialism that will include the following 5 of its basic features. 1. The concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation, on the basis of this finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. 3. The export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities acquires exceptional importance. 4. The formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world among themselves. And 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed. Imperialism is capitalism at that stage of development at which the dominance of monopolies and finance capital is established, in which the export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trusts has begun, in which the division of all territories of the globe among the biggest capitalist powers has been completed. We shall see later that imperialism can and must be defined differently if we bear in mind not only the basic, purely economic concepts to which the above definition is limited. but also the historical place of the stage of capitalism in relation to capitalism in general, or the relation between imperialism and the two main trends in the working class movement. The thing to be noted at this point is that imperialism, as interpreted above, undoubtedly represents a special stage in the development of capitalism. To enable the reader to obtain the most well-grounded idea of imperialism, I deliberately tried to quote as extensively as possible bourgeois economists who have to admit the particularly incontrovertible facts concerning the latest stage of capitalist economy. With the same object in view, I have quoted detailed statistics which enable one to see to what degree bank capital, etc., has grown, in what precisely the transformation of quantity into quality, of developed capitalism into imperialism, was expressed. Needless to say, of course, all boundaries in nature and in society are conventional and changeable, and it would be absurd to argue, for example, about the particular year or decade in which imperialism definitely became established. In the matter of defining imperialism, however, we have to enter into controversy, primarily with Karl Kautsky, the principal Marxist theoretician of the epoch of the so-called Second International, that is, of the 25 years between 1889 and 1914. The fundamental ideas expressed in our definition of imperialism were very resolutely attacked by Kautsky in 1915, and even in November 1914, when he said that imperialism must not be regarded as a phase or stage of economy, but as a policy, a definite policy preferred by finance capital. That imperialism must not be identified with present-day capitalism. That if imperialism is to be understood to mean all the phenomena of present-day capitalism, cartels, protection, the domination of the financiers, and colonial policy, then the question as to whether imperialism is necessary to capitalism becomes reduced to the flattest tautology, because, in that case, imperialism is naturally a vital necessity for capitalism, and so on. The best way to present Kautsky's idea is to quote his own definition of imperialism, which is diametrically opposed to the substance of the ideas which I have set forth, for the objections coming from the camp of the German Marxists, who have been advocating similar ideas for many years already, have been long known to Kautsky as the objections of a definite trend in Marxism. Kautsky's definition is as follows. Imperialism is a product of highly developed industrial capitalism. It consists in the striving of every industrial capitalist nation to bring under its control or to annex all large areas of agrarian territory, irrespective of what nations inhabit it. This definition is of no use at all because it one-sidedly, i.e. arbitrarily, singles out only the national question, although the latter is extremely important in itself as well as in its relation to imperialism. It arbitrarily and inaccurately connects this question only with industrial capital in the countries which annex other nations, and in an equally arbitrary and inaccurate manner pushes into the forefront the annexation of agrarian regions. Imperialism is a striving for annexations. This is what the political part of Kautsky's definition amounts to. It is correct, but very incomplete, for politically, imperialism is, in general, a striving towards violence and reaction. For the moment, however, we are interested in the economic aspect of the question, which Kautsky himself introduced in his definition. The inaccuracies in Kautsky's definition are glaring. The characteristic feature of imperialism is not industrial, but finance capital. It is not an accident that in France, it was precisely the extraordinarily rapid development of finance capital and the weakening of industrial capital that from the 80s onwards gave rise to the extreme intensification of annexationist colonial policy. The characteristic feature of imperialism is precisely that it thrives to annex not only agrarian territories, but even most highly industrialized regions, German appetite for Belgium, French appetite for Lorraine. Because, 1, the fact that the world is already partitioned obliges those contemplating a redivision to reach out for every kind of territory, and 2, an essential feature of imperialism is the rivalry between several great powers in the striving for hegemony, i.e., for the conquest of territory, not so much directly for themselves as to weaken the adversary and undermine his hegemony. Belgium is particularly important for Germany as a base for operations against Britain. Britain needs Baghdad as a base for operations against Germany, etc. Kautsky refers especially and repeatedly to English writers who, he alleges, have given a purely political meaning to the word imperialism in the sense that he, Kautsky, understands it. We take up the work by the English writer Hobson, Imperialism, which appeared in 1902, and there we read, "The new imperialism differs from the older, first, in substituting for the ambition of a single growing empire the theory and the practice of competing empires, each motivated by similar lusts of political aggrandizement and commercial gain. Secondly, in the dominance of financial or investing over mercantile interests." We see that Kautsky is absolutely wrong in referring to English writers generally, unless he meant the vulgar English imperialists or the avowed apologists for imperialism. We see that Kautsky, while claiming that he continues to advocate Marxism, as a matter of fact, takes a step backward compared with the social liberal Hobson, who more correctly takes into account two historically concrete, Kautsky's definition is a mockery of historical concreteness, features of modern imperialism. 1. The competition between several imperialisms, and 2. The predominance of the financier over the merchant. If it is chiefly a question of the annexation of agrarian countries by industrial countries, then the role of the merchant is put in the forefront. Kautsky's definition is not only wrong and un-Marxist, it serves as a basis for a whole system of views which signify a rupture with Marxist theory and Marxist practice all along the line. I shall refer to this later. The argument about words which Kautsky raises as to whether the latest stage of capitalism should be called imperialism or the stage of finance capital is not worth serious attention. Call it what you will, it makes no difference. The essence of the matter is that Kautsky detaches the politics of imperialism from its economics, speaks of annexations as being a policy preferred by finance capital, and opposes to it another bourgeois policy which, he alleges, is possible on this very same basis of finance capital. It follows then that monopolies in the economy are compatible with non-monopolistic, non-violent, non-annexationist methods in politics. It follows, then, that the territorial division of the world, which was completed during this very epoch of finance capital, and which constitutes the basis of the present peculiar forms of rivalry between the biggest capitalist states, is compatible with a non-imperialist policy. The result is a slurring over and a blunting of the most profound contradictions of the latest stage of capitalism, instead of an exposure of their depth. The result is bourgeois reformism instead of Marxism. Kautsky enters into controversy with the German apologist of imperialism and annexations, Kuhnau, who clumsily and cynically argues that imperialism is present-day capitalism. The development of capitalism is inevitable and progressive. Therefore, imperialism is progressive. Therefore, we should grovel before it and glorify it. This is something like the caricature of the Russian Marxists, which, like the Narodniks, drew in 1894 to 95. They argued, if the Marxists believe that capitalism is inevitable in Russia, that it is progressive, then they ought to open a tavern and begin to implant capitalism. Kautsky's reply to Kuhnau is as follows. Imperialism is not present-day capitalism. It is only one of the forms of the policy of present-day capitalism. This policy we can and should fight imperialism, annexations, etc. The reply seems quite plausible, but in effect, it is a more subtle and more disguised, and therefore more dangerous, advocacy of conciliation with imperialism, because a fight against the policy of the trusts and banks that does not affect the economic basis of the trusts and banks is mere bourgeois reform and pacifism. The benevolent and innocent expression of pious wishes. Evasion of existing contradictions, forgetting the most important of them, instead of revealing their full depth, such is Kautsky's theory, which has nothing in common with Marxism. Naturally, such a theory can only serve the purpose of advocating unity with the Kuhnaus. From the purely economic point of view, writes Kautsky, it is not impossible that capitalism will yet go through a new phase, that of the extension of the policy of the cartels to foreign policy, the phase of ultra-imperialism, i.e. of a super-imperialism, of a union of the imperialisms of the whole world and not struggles among them, a phase when wars shall cease under capitalism, a phase of the joint exploitation of the world by internationally united finance capital. We shall have to deal with this theory of ultra-imperialism later on in order to show in detail how decisively and completely it breaks with Marxism. At present, in keeping with the general plan of the present work, we must examine the exact economic data on this question. From the purely economic point of view, is ultra-imperialism possible or is it ultra-nonsense? If the purely economic point of view is meant to be a pure abstraction, then all that can be said reduces itself to the following proposition. development is proceeding towards monopolies, hence, towards a single world monopoly, towards a single trust. This is indisputable, but it is also as completely meaningless as is the statement that development is proceeding towards the manufacture of foodstuffs in laboratories. In this sense, the theory of ultra-imperialism is no less absurd than a theory of ultra-agriculture would be. If, however, we are discussing the purely economic conditions of the epoch of finance capital as a historically concrete epoch which began at the turn of the 20th century, then the best reply that one can make to the lifeless abstractions of ultra-imperialism, which serve exclusively a most reactionary aim, that of diverting attention from the depth of existing antagonisms, is to contrast them with the concrete economic realities of the present-day world economy. Kautsky's utterly meaningless talk about ultra-imperialism encourages, among other things, that profoundly mistaken idea which only brings grist to the mill of the apologists of imperialism, i.e., that the rule of finance capital lessens the unevenness and contradictions inherent in the world economy, whereas in reality it increases them. R. Calwer, in his little book, An Introduction to the World Economy, made an attempt to summarize the main, purely economic, data that enables one to obtain a concrete picture of the internal relations of the world economy at the turn of the 20th century. He divides the world into 5 main economic areas, as follows: Central Europe, the whole of Europe with the exception of Russia and Great Britain, Russia, Eastern Asia, America. He includes the colonies in the areas of the states to which they belong and leaves aside a few countries not distributed according to areas, such as Persia, Afghanistan, and Arabia in Asia, Morocco, Abyssinia in Africa, etc. Here is a brief summary of the economic data he quotes on these regions. Refer to Figure 7a in the PDF companion. We see 3 areas of highly developed capitalism: high development of means of transport, of trade, and of industry, the Central European, the British, and the American areas. Among these are 3 states which dominate the world: Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. Imperialist rivalry and the struggle between these countries have become extremely keen because Germany has only an insignificant area and few colonies. The creation of Central Europe is still a matter for the future. It is being born in the midst of a desperate struggle. For the moment, the distinctive feature of the whole of Europe is political disunity. In the British and American areas, on the other hand, political concentration is very highly developed, but there is a vast disparity between the immense colonies of the one and the insignificant colonies of the other. In the colonies, however, capitalism is only beginning to develop. The struggle for South America is becoming more and more acute. There are 2 areas where capitalism is little developed: Russia and Eastern Asia. In the former, the population is extremely sparse. In the latter, it is extremely dense. In the former, political concentration is high. In the latter, it does not exist. The partitioning of China is only just beginning, and the struggle for it between Japan, the US, etc., is continually gaining in intensity. Compare this reality, the vast diversity of economic and political conditions, the extreme disparity in the rate of development of the various countries, etc., and the violent struggles among the imperialist states, with Kautsky's silly little fable about peaceful ultra-imperialism. Is this not the reactionary attempt of a frightened Philistine to hide from stern reality? Are not the international cartels, which Kautsky imagines are the embryos of ultra-imperialism, in the same way as one can describe the manufacture of tablets in a laboratory as ultra-agriculture in embryo, an example of the division and the redivision of the world, the transition from peaceful division to non-peaceful division and vice versa? Is not American and other finance capital, which divided the whole world peacefully with Germany's participation in, for example, the International Rail Syndicate or in the International Mercantile Shipping Trust, now engaged in redividing the world on the basis of a new relation of forces that is being changed by methods anything but peaceful? Finance capital and the trusts do not diminish but increase the differences in the rate of growth of the various parts of the world economy. Once the relation of forces is changed, what other solution of contradictions can be found under capitalism than that of force? Railway statistics provide remarkably exact data on the different rates of growth of capitalism and finance capital in world economy. In the last decades of imperialist development, the total length of railways has changed as follows. Refer to Figure 7b in the PDF companion. Thus, the development of railways has been most rapid in the colonies and in the independent and semi-independent states of Asia and America. Here, as we know, the finance capital of the 4 or 5 biggest capitalist states holds undisputed sway. 200,000 kilometers of new railways in the colonies and in the other countries of Asia and America represent a capital of more than 40,000 million marks newly invested on particularly advantageous terms, with special guarantees of a good return and with profitable orders for steelworks, etc., etc. Capitalism is growing with the greatest rapidity in the colonies and in overseas countries. Among the latter, new imperialist powers are emerging, e.g., Japan. The struggle among the world imperialisms is becoming more acute. The tribute levied by finance capital on the most profitable colonial and overseas enterprises is increasing. In the division of this booty, an exceptionally large part goes to countries which do not always stand at the top of the list in the rapidity of the development of their productive forces. In the case of the biggest countries, together with their colonies, the total length of railways was as follows. Refer to figure 7C in the PDF companion. Thus, about 80% of the total existing railways are concentrated in the hands of the 5 biggest powers, but the concentration of the ownership of these railways, the concentration of finance capital, is immeasurably greater since the French and British millionaires, for example, own an enormous amount of shares and bonds in American, Russian, and other railways. Thanks to her colonies, Great Britain has increased the length of her railways by 100,000 kilometers, 4 times as much as Germany, and yet, it is well known that the development of productive forces in Germany, and especially the development of coal and iron industries, has been incomparably more rapid during this period than in Britain, not to speak of France and Russia. In 1892, Germany produced 4,900,000 tons of pig iron, and Great Britain produced 6,800,000 tons. In 1912, Germany produced 17,600,000 tons, and Great Britain 9 million tons. Germany, therefore, had an overwhelming superiority over Britain in this respect. The question is, what means other than war could there be under capitalism to overcome the disparity between the development of productive forces and the accumulation of capital on the one side, and the division of colonies and spheres of influence for finance capital on the other? Chapter 8. Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. We now have to examine yet another significant aspect of imperialism to which most of the discussions on the subject usually attach insufficient importance. One of the shortcomings of the Marxist Hilferding is that on this point he has taken a step backward compared with the non-Marxist Hobson. I refer to parasitism, which is characteristic of imperialism. As we have seen, the deepest economic foundation of imperialism is monopoly. This is capitalist monopoly, i.e., monopoly which has grown out of capitalism and which exists in the general environment of capitalism, commodity production and competition, in permanent and insoluble contradiction to this general environment. Nevertheless, like all monopoly, it inevitably engenders a tendency of stagnation and decay. Since monopoly prices are established, even temporarily, the motive cause of technical and, consequently, of all other progress disappears to a certain extent and, further, the economic possibility arises of deliberately retarding technical progress. For instance, in America, a certain Owens invented a machine which revolutionized the manufacture of bottles. The German bottle manufacturing cartel purchased Owens' patent, but pigeonholed it, refrained from utilizing it. Certainly, monopoly under capitalism can never completely, and for a very long period of time, eliminate competition in the world market, and this, by the by, is one of the reasons why the theory of ultra-imperialism is so absurd. Certainly, the possibility of reducing the cost of production and increasing profits by introducing technical improvements operates in the direction of change. But the tendency to stagnation and decay, which is characteristic of monopoly, continues to operate. And in some branches of industry, in some countries, for certain periods of time, it gains the upper hand. The monopoly ownership of very extensive, rich or well-situated colonies operates in the same direction. Further, imperialism is an immense accumulation of money capital in a few countries, amounting, as we have seen, to 100,000 to 50 million francs in securities. Hence the extraordinary growth of a class, or rather, of a stratum of rentiers, i.e., people who live by clipping coupons, who take no part in any enterprise whatsoever, whose profession is idleness. The export of capital, one of the most essential economic bases of imperialism, still more completely isolates the rentiers from production and sets the seal of parasitism on the whole country that lives by exploiting the labor of several overseas countries and colonies. In 1893, writes Hobson, the British capital invested abroad represented about 15% of the total wealth of the United Kingdom. Let me remind the reader that by 1915, this capital had increased about 2.5 times. Aggressive imperialism, says Hobson further on, which costs the taxpayer so dear, which is of so little value to the manufacturer and trader, is a source of great gain to the investor. The annual income Great Britain derives from commissions in her whole foreign and colonial trade, import and export, is estimated by Sir R. Giffen at £80 million, nearly 170 million rubles for 1899, taken at 2.5%, upon a turnover of £800 million. Great as this sum is, it cannot explain the aggressive imperialism of Great Britain, which is explained by the income of 90 million to 100 million from invested capital, the income of the rentiers. The income of the rentiers is 5 times greater than the income obtained from the foreign trade of the biggest trading country in the world. This is the essence of imperialism and imperialist parasitism. For that reason, the term rentier state, Rentnerstaat, or usurer state is coming into common use in the economic literature that deals with imperialism. The world has become divided into a handful of usurer states and a vast majority of debtor states. At the top of the list of foreign investments, says Schultz-Gavernitz, are those placed in politically dependent or allied countries. Great Britain grants loans to Egypt, Japan, China, and South America. Her navy plays here the part of bailiff in case of necessity. Great Britain's political power protects her from the indignation of her debtors. Sartorius von Waltershausen, in his book, The National Economic System of Capital Investments Abroad, cites Holland as the model rentier state and points out that Great Britain and France are now becoming such. Schilder is of the opinion that 5 industrial states have become definitely pronounced creditor countries: Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Switzerland. He does not include Holland in this list simply because she is industrially little developed. The United States is a creditor only of the American countries. Great Britain, says Schultz-Gavernitz, is gradually becoming transformed from an industrial into a creditor state, notwithstanding the absolute increase in industrial output and the export of income from interest and dividends, issues of securities, commissions, and speculation in the whole of the national economy. In my opinion, it is precisely this that forms the economic basis of imperialist ascendancy. The creditor is more firmly attached to the debtor than the seller is to the buyer. In regard to Germany, A. Landsberg, the publisher of the Berlin Die Bank, in 1911, in an article entitled Germany, a Rentier State, wrote the following: People in Germany are ready to sneer at the yearning to become rentiers that is observed in France. But they forget that as far as the bourgeoisie is concerned, the situation in Germany is becoming more and more like that in France. The rentier state is a state of parasitic, decaying capitalism, and this circumstance cannot fail to influence all the socio-political conditions of the countries concerned, in general, and the 2 fundamental trends in the working class movement, in particular. To demonstrate this in the clearest possible manner, let me quote Hobson, who is a most reliable witness, since he cannot be suspected of leaning towards Marxist orthodoxy. On the other hand, he is an Englishman who is very well acquainted with the situation in the country, which is richest in colonies, in finance capital, and the imperialist experience. With the Anglo-Boer War fresh in his mind, Hobson describes the connection between imperialism and the interests of the financiers, their growing profits from contracts, supplies, etc., and writes, while the directors of this definitely parasitic policy are capitalists, the same motives appeal to special classes of the workers. In many towns, most important trades are dependent upon government employment or contracts. The imperialism of the metal and shipbuilding centers is attributable in no small degree to this fact. 2 sets of circumstances, in this writer's opinion, have weakened the old empires. 1. Economic parasitism, and 2. the formation of armies recruited from subject peoples. There is first the habit of economic parasitism, by which the ruling state has used its provinces, colonies, and dependencies in order to enrich its ruling class and to bribe its lower classes into acquiescence. And I shall add that the economic possibility of such bribery, whatever its form may be, requires high monopolist profits. As for the second circumstance, Hobson writes, one of the strangest symptoms of the blindness of imperialism is the reckless indifference with which Great Britain, France, and other imperial nations are embarking on this perilous dependence. Great Britain has gone farthest. Most of the fighting by which we have won our Indian empire has been done by natives. In India, as more recently in Egypt, great standing armies are placed under British commanders. Almost all the fighting associated with our African dominions, except in the southern part, has been done for us by natives. Hobson gives the following economic appraisal of the prospect of the partitioning of China. The greatest part of Western Europe might then assume the appearance and character already exhibited by tracts of country in the south of England, in the Riviera, and in the tourist-ridden or residential parts of Italy and Switzerland. Little clusters of wealthy aristocrats drawing dividends and pensions from the Far East, with a somewhat larger group of professional retainers and tradesmen, and a larger body of personal servants and workers in the transport trade and in the final stages of production of the more perishable goods. All the main arterial industries would have disappeared, the staple foods and manufactures flowing in as tribute from Asia and Africa. We have foreshadowed the possibility of even a larger alliance of Western states, a European federation of great powers which, so far from forwarding the cause of world civilization, might introduce the gigantic peril of a Western parasitism, a group of advanced industrial nations whose upper classes drew vast tribute from Asia and Africa, with which they supported great tame masses of retainers, no longer engaged in the staple industries of agriculture and manufacture, but kept in the performance of personal or minor industrial services under the control of a new financial aristocracy. Let those who would scout such a theory, it would be better to say prospect, as undeserving of consideration examine the economic and social condition of districts in southern England today which are already reduced to this condition, and reflect upon the vast extension of such a system which might be rendered feasible by the subjection of China to the economic control of similar groups of financiers, investors, and political and business officials, draining the greatest potential reservoir of profit the world has ever known in order to consume it in Europe. The situation is far too complex, the play of world forces far too incalculable, to render this or any other single interpretation of the future very probable. But the influences which govern the imperialism of Western Europe today are moving in this direction and, unless counteracted or diverted, make towards some such consummation. The author is quite right. If the forces of imperialism had not been counteracted, they would have led precisely to what he has described. The significance of a United States of Europe in the present imperialist situation is correctly appraised. He should have added, however, that, also within the working class movement, the opportunists, who are for the moment victorious in most countries, are working systematically and undeviatingly in this very direction. Imperialism, which means the partitioning of the world, and the exploitation of other countries besides China, which means high monopoly profits for a handful of very rich countries, makes it economically possible to bribe the upper strata of the proletariat and thereby fosters, gives shape to, and strengthens opportunism. We must not, however, lose sight of the forces which counteract imperialism in general, and opportunism in particular, and which, naturally, the social liberal Hobson is unable to perceive. The German opportunist, Gerhard Hildebrand, who was once expelled from the party for defending imperialism, and who could today be a leader of the so-called Social Democratic Party of Germany, supplements Hobson well by his advocacy of a United States of Western Europe without Russia for the purpose of joint action against the African Negroes, against the Great Islamic Movement, for the maintenance of a powerful army and navy, against a Sino-Japanese coalition, etc. The description of British imperialism in Schultz-Gavernitz's book reveals the same parasitical traits. The national income of Great Britain approximately doubled from 1865 to 1898, while the income from abroad increased ninefold in the same period, while the merit of imperialism is that it trains the Negro to habits of industry. The danger of imperialism lies in that Europe will shift the burden of physical toil, first agricultural and mining, then the rougher work in industry, onto the colored races, and itself be content with the role of rentier, and in this way, perhaps, paved the way for the economic and later, the political emancipation of the colored races. An increasing proportion of land in England is being taken out of cultivation and used for sport, for the diversion of the rich. As far as Scotland, the most aristocratic place for hunting and other sports, is concerned, it is said that it lives on its past and on Mr. Carnegie, the American multimillionaire. On horse racing and fox hunting alone, England annually spends £14 million, nearly 130 million rubles. The number of rentiers in England is about 1 million. The percentage of the productively employed population to the total population is declining. Refer to figure 8A in the PDF companion. And in speaking of the British working class, the bourgeois student of British imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century is obliged to distinguish systematically between the upper stratum of the workers and the lower stratum of the proletariat proper. The upper stratum furnishes the bulk of the membership of cooperatives, of trade unions, of sporting clubs, and of numerous religious sects. To this level is adapted the electoral system, which in Great Britain is still sufficiently restricted to exclude the lower stratum of the proletariat proper. In order to present the condition of the British working class in a rosy light, only this upper stratum, which constitutes a minority of the proletariat, is usually spoken of. For instance, the problem of unemployment is mainly a London problem and that of the lower proletarian stratum, to which the politicians attach little importance. He should have said, to which the bourgeois politicians and the socialist opportunists attach little importance. One of the special features of imperialism connected with the facts I am describing is the decline in emigration from imperialist countries and the increase in immigration into these countries from the more backward countries where lower wages are paid. As Hobson observes, emigration from Great Britain has been declining since 1884. In that year, the number of emigrants was 242,000, while in 1900, the number was 169,000. Emigration from Germany reached the highest point between 1881 and 1890, with a total of 1,453,000 emigrants. In the course of the following 2 decades, it fell to 544,000 and to 341,000. On the other hand, there was an increase in the number of workers entering Germany from Austria, Italy, Russia, and other countries. According to the 1907 census, there were 1,342,294 foreigners in Germany, of whom 440,800 were industrial workers and 257,329 agricultural workers. In France, the workers employed in the mining industry are, in great part, foreigners, Poles, Italians, and Spaniards. In the United States, immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe are engaged in the most poorly paid jobs, while American workers provide the highest percentage of overseers or of the better paid workers. Imperialism has the tendency to create privileged sections also among the workers, and to detach them from the broad masses of the proletariat. It must be observed that in Great Britain, the tendency of imperialism to split the workers, to strengthen opportunism among them, and to cause temporary decay in the working class movement revealed itself much earlier than the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. For 2 important distinguishing features of imperialism were already observed in Great Britain in the middle of the 19th century: vast colonial possessions and a monopolist position in the world market. Marx and Engels traced this connection between opportunism in the working class movement and the imperialist features of British capitalism systematically during the course of several decades. For example, on October 7, 1858, Engels wrote to Marx, "The English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeoisie. For a nation which exploits the whole world, this is of course to a certain extent justifiable." Almost a quarter of a century later, in a letter dated August 11, 1881, Engels speaks of the worst English trade unions which allow themselves to be led by men sold to, or at least paid by, the middle class. In a letter to Kautsky, dated September 12, 1882, Engels wrote, "You ask me what the English workers think about colonial policy. Well, exactly the same as they think about politics in general. There is no Workers' Party here. There are only conservatives and liberal radicals, and the workers gaily share the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies. Engels expressed similar ideas in the press in his preface to the second edition of The Condition of the Working Class in England, which appeared in 1892. This clearly shows the causes and effects. The causes are 1. Exploitation of the whole world by this country, 2. Its monopolist position in the world market, 3. Its colonial monopoly. The effects are 1. A section of the British proletariat becomes bourgeois. 2. A section of the proletariat allows itself to be led by men bought by, or at least paid by, the bourgeoisie. The imperialism of the beginning of the 20th century completed the division of the world among a handful of states, each of which today exploits, in a sense of drawing super profits from, a part of the whole world, only a little smaller than that which England exploited in 1858. Each of them occupies a monopolist position in the world market thanks to trusts, cartels, finance capital, and creditor and debtor relations. Each of them enjoys to some degree a colonial monopoly. We have seen that out of the total of 75 million square kilometers, which comprise the whole colonial world, 65 million square kilometers, or 86%, belongs to 6 powers. 61 million square kilometers, or 81%, belong to 3 powers. The distinctive feature of the present situation is the prevalence of such economic and political conditions that are bound to increase the irreconcilability between opportunism and the general and vital interests of the working class movement. Imperialism has grown from an embryo into the predominant system. Capitalist monopolies occupy first place in economics and politics. The division of the world has been completed. On the other hand, instead of the undivided monopoly of Great Britain, we see a few imperialist powers contending for the right to share in this monopoly, and this struggle is characteristic of the whole period of the early 20th century. Opportunism cannot now be completely triumphant in the working class movement of one country for decades as it was in Britain in the second half of the 19th century, but in a number of countries it has grown ripe, overripe, and rotten, and has become completely merged with bourgeois policy in the form of social chauvinism. Chapter 9. Critique of Imperialism. By the critique of imperialism, in the broad sense of the term, we mean the attitude of the different classes of society towards imperialist policy in connection with their general ideology. The enormous dimensions of finance capital concentrated in a few hands and creating an extraordinarily dense and widespread network of relationships and connections, which subordinates not only the small and medium, but also the very small capitalists and small masters, on the other hand, and the increasingly intense struggle waged against other national state groups of financiers for the division of the world and domination over other countries, on the other hand, caused the propertied classes to go over entirely to the side of imperialism. The enormous dimensions of finance capital concentrated in a few hands and creating an extraordinarily dense and widespread network of relationships and connections, which subordinates not only the small and medium, but also the very small capitalists and small masters, on the other hand, and the increasingly intense struggle waged against other national state groups of financiers for the division of the world and domination over other countries, on the other hand, caused the propertied classes to go over entirely to the side of imperialism. General enthusiasm over the prospects of imperialism, furious defense of it, and painting it in the brightest colors. Such are the signs of the times. Imperialist ideology also penetrates the working class. No Chinese wall separates it from the other classes. The leaders of the present-day so-called Social Democratic Party of Germany are justly called social imperialists, that is, socialists in words and imperialists in deeds. But as early as 1902, Hobson noted the existence in Britain of Fabian imperialists who belonged to the opportunist Fabian society. Bourgeois scholars and publicists usually come out in defense of imperialism in a somewhat veiled form. They obscure it completely. Domination and its deep-going roots strive to push specific and secondary details into the forefront and do their very best to distract attention from essentials by means of absolutely ridiculous schemes for reform, such as police supervision of the trusts or banks, etc. Cynical and frank imperialists, who are bold enough to admit the absurdity of the idea of reforming the fundamental characteristics of imperialism, are a rarer phenomenon. Here is an example. The German imperialists attempt, in the magazine Archives of World Economy, to follow the national emancipation movements in the colonies, particularly, of course, in colonies other than those belonging to Germany. They note the unrest and the protest movements in India, the movement in Natal, South Africa, in the Dutch East Indies, etc. One of them, commenting on an English report of a conference held on June 28th to 30th, 1910, of representatives of various subject nations and races, of peoples of Asia, Africa, and Europe who are under foreign rule, writes as follows in appraising the speeches delivered at this conference. We are told that we must fight imperialism, that the ruling states should recognize the right of subject peoples to independence, that an international tribunal should supervise the fulfillment of treaties concluded between the great powers and weak peoples. Further than the expression of these pious wishes, they do not go. We see no trace of understanding of the fact that imperialism is inseparably bound up with capitalism in its present form, and that, therefore, an open struggle against imperialism would be hopeless unless, perhaps, the fight were to be confined to protests against certain of its especially abhorrent excesses. Since the reform of the basis of imperialism is a deception, a pious wish, since the bourgeois representatives of the oppressed nations go no further forward, the bourgeois representative of an oppressing nation goes further backward to servility towards imperialism under cover of the claim to be scientific. That is also logic. The questions as to whether it is possible to reform the basis of imperialism, whether to go forward to the further intensification and deepening of the antagonisms which it engenders, or backward, towards allaying these antagonisms, are fundamental questions in the critique of imperialism. Since the specific political features of imperialism are reaction everywhere and increased national oppression due to the oppression of the financial oligarchy and the elimination of free competition, a petty bourgeois democratic opposition to imperialism arose at the beginning of the 20th century in nearly all imperialist countries. Kautsky not only did not trouble to oppose, was not only unable to oppose this petty bourgeois reformist opposition, which is really reactionary in its economic basis, but became merged with it in practice. And this is precisely where Kautsky and the broad international Kautskyan trend deserted Marxism. In the United States, the imperialist war waged against Spain in 1898 stirred up the opposition of the anti-imperialists, the last of the Mohicans of bourgeois democracy who declared this war to be criminal, regarded the annexation of foreign territories as a violation of the Constitution, declared that the treatment of Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipinos — the Americans promised him the independence of his country but later landed troops and annexed it — was jingo treachery, and quoted the words of Lincoln. When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs others, it is no longer self-government, it is despotism. But as long as all this criticism shrank from recognizing the inseverable bond between imperialism and the trusts, and, therefore, between imperialism and the foundations of capitalism, while it shrank from joining the forces engendered by large-scale capitalism and its development, it remained a pious wish. This is also the main attitude taken by Hobson in his critique of imperialism. Hobson anticipated Kautsky in protesting against the inevitability of imperialism argument, and in urging the necessity of increasing the consuming capacity of the people under capitalism. The petty bourgeois point of view in the critique of imperialism, the omnipotence of the banks, the financial oligarchy, etc., is adopted by the authors I have often quoted, such as Agade, A. Landsberg, L. Eschwege, and among the French writers, Victor Berard, author of a superficial book entitled England and Imperialism, which appeared in 1900. All these authors, who make no claim to be Marxists, contrast imperialism with free competition and democracy, condemn the Baghdad railway scheme, which is leading to conflicts and war, utter pious wishes for peace, etc. This applies also to the compiler of international stock and share issue statistics, A. Neymark, who, after calculating the thousands of millions of francs representing international securities, exclaimed in 1912, "Is it possible to believe that peace may be disturbed? That, in the face of these enormous figures, anyone would risk starting a war?" Such simple-mindedness on the part of the bourgeois economists is not surprising. Moreover, it is in their interest to pretend to be so naive and to talk seriously about peace under imperialism. But what remains of Kautsky's Marxism when, in 1914, 1915, and 1916, he takes up the same bourgeois reformist point of view and affirms that everybody is agreed, imperialists, pseudo-socialists, and social pacifists, on the matter of peace? Instead of an analysis of imperialism and an exposure of the depths of its contradictions, we have nothing but a reformist, pious wish to wave them aside, to evade them. Here is a sample of Kautsky's economic criticism of imperialism. He takes the statistics of the British export and import trade with Egypt from 1872 and 1912. It seems that this export and import trade has grown more slowly than British foreign trade as a whole. From this, Kautsky concludes that we have no reason to suppose that without military occupation, the growth of British trade with Egypt would have been less, simply as a result of the mere operation of economic factors. The urge of capital to expand can be best promoted not by the violent methods of imperialism, but by peaceful democracy. This argument of Kautsky's, which is repeated in every key by his Russian armor-bearer and Russian shielder of the social chauvinists, Mr. Spectator, constitutes the basis of Kautskyan critique of imperialism, and that is why we must deal with it in greater detail. We will begin with a quotation from Hilferding, whose conclusions Kautsky on many occasions, and notably in April 1915, has declared to have been unanimously adopted by all socialist theoreticians. It is not the business of the proletariat, writes Hilferding, to contrast the more progressive capitalist policy with that of the now bygone era of free trade and of hostility towards the state. The reply of the proletariat to the economic policy of finance capital, to imperialism, cannot be free trade, but socialism. The aim of proletarian policy cannot today be the ideal of restoring free competition, which has now become a reactionary ideal, but the complete elimination of competition by the abolition of capitalism. Kautsky broke with Marxism by advocating in the epoch of finance capital a reactionary ideal, peaceful democracy, the mere operation of economic factors. For objectively, this ideal drags us back from monopoly to non-monopoly capitalism and is a reformist swindle. Trade with Egypt or with any other colony or semi-colony would have grown more without military occupation, without imperialism, and without finance capital. What does this mean? That capitalism would have developed more rapidly if free competition had not been restricted by monopolies in general, or by the connections, yoke, i.e. also the monopoly of finance capital, or by the monopolist possession of colonies by certain countries? Kautsky's argument can have no other meaning, and this meaning is meaningless. Let us assume that free competition without any sort of monopoly would have developed capitalism and trade more rapidly. But the more rapidly trade and capitalism develop, the greater is the concentration of production and capital, which gives rise to monopoly. And monopolies have already arisen, precisely out of free competition. Even if monopolies have now begun to retard progress, it is not an argument in favor of free competition, which has become impossible after it has given rise to monopoly. Whichever way one turns Kautsky's argument, one will find nothing in it except reaction and bourgeois reform. Even if we correct this argument and say, as Spectator says, that the trade of the colonies with Britain is now developing more slowly than their trade with other countries, it does not save Kautsky, for it is also monopoly, also imperialism that is beating Great Britain. Only it is the monopoly and imperialism of another country, America, Germany. It is known that the cartels have given rise to a new and peculiar form of protective tariffs, i.e., goods suitable for export and protected. Engels noted this in Volume 3 of Capital. It is known, too, that the cartels and finance capital have a system peculiar to themselves, that of exporting goods at cut-rate prices, or dumping, as the English call it. Within a given country, the cartel sells its goods at high monopoly prices, but sells them abroad at a much lower price to undercut the competitor, to enlarge its own production to the utmost, etc. If Germany's trade with the British colonies is developing more rapidly than Great Britain's, it only proves that German imperialism is younger, stronger, and better organized than British imperialism, is superior to it, but it by no means proves the superiority of free trade. For it is not a fight between free trade and protection and colonial dependence, but between two rival imperialisms, two monopolies, two groups of finance capital. The superiority of German imperialism over British imperialism is more potent than the wall of colonial frontiers or of protective tariffs. To use this as an argument in favor of free trade and peaceful democracy is banal. It means forgetting the essential features and characteristics of imperialism, substituting petty bourgeois reformism for Marxism. It is interesting to note that even the bourgeois economist, A. Landsberg, whose criticism of imperialism is as petty bourgeois as Kautsky's, nevertheless got closer to a more scientific study of trade statistics. He did not compare one single country chosen at random and one single colony with the other countries. He examined the export trade of an imperialist country, one, with countries which are financially dependent upon it and borrow money from it, and two, with countries which are financially independent. He obtained the following results. Refer to figure 9a in the PDF companion. Landsberg did not draw conclusions and, therefore, strangely enough, failed to observe that if the figures prove anything at all, they prove that he is wrong. For the exports to countries financially dependent on Germany have grown more rapidly, if only slightly, than exports to the countries which are financially independent. I emphasize the if, for Landsberg's figures are far from complete. Tracing the connection between exports and loans, Landsberg writes, in 1890 to 91, a Romanian loan was floated through the German banks, which had already in previous years made advances on this loan. It was used chiefly to purchase railway materials in Germany. In 1891, Germany exports to Romania amounted to 55 million marks. The following year, they dropped to 39.4 million marks and, with fluctuations, to 25.4 million in 1900. Only in very recent years have they regained the level of 1891, thanks to two new loans. German exports to Portugal rose, following the loans of 1888 to 21,100,000, 1890. Then in the following 2 years, they dropped to 16,200,000 and 7,400,000, and regained their former level only in 1903. The figures of German trade with Argentina are still more striking. Loans were floated in 1888 and 1890. German exports to Argentina reached 60,700,000 marks, 1889. 2 years later, they amounted to only 18,600,000 marks, less than one-third of the previous figure. It was not until 1901 that they regained and surpassed the level of 1889, and then only as a result of new loans floated by the state and by municipalities, with advances to build power stations and with other credit operations. Exports to Chile, as a consequence of the loan of 1889, rose to 45,200,000 marks in 1892, and a year later dropped to 22,500,000 marks. A new Chilean loan floated by the German banks in 1906 was followed by a rise of exports to 84,700,000 marks in 1907, only to fall again to 52,400,000 marks in 1908. From these facts, Landsberg draws the amusing petty bourgeois moral of how unstable and irregular export trade is when it is bound up with loans, how bad it is to invest capital abroad instead of naturally and harmoniously developing home industry, how costly are the millions in bakshish that Krupp has to pay in floating foreign loans, etc. But the facts tell us clearly, the increase in exports is connected with just these swindling tricks of finance capital, which is not concerned with bourgeois morality, but with skimming the ox twice. First, it pockets the profits from the loan. Then it pockets other profits from the same loan which the borrower uses to make purchases from Krupp or to purchase railway material from the steel syndicate, etc. I repeat that I do not by any means consider Landsberg's figures to be perfect, but I had to quote them because they are more scientific than Kautsky's and Spectator's, and because Landsberg showed the correct way to approach the question. In discussing the significance of finance capital in regards to exports, etc., one must be able to single out the connection of exports, especially and solely with the tricks of the financiers, especially and solely with the sale of goods by cartels, etc. Simply to compare colonies with non-colonies, one imperialism with another imperialism, one semi-colony or colony, Egypt, with all other countries, is to evade and to obscure the very essence of the question. Kautsky's theoretical critique of imperialism has nothing in common with Marxism, and serves only as a preamble to propaganda for peace and unity with the opportunists and the social chauvinists. Precisely for the reason that it evades and obscures the very profound and fundamental contradictions of imperialism, the contradictions between monopoly and free competition which exists side by side with it, between the gigantic operations and gigantic profits of finance capital and honest trade in the free market, the contradiction between cartels and trusts on the one hand and non-cartelized industry on the other, etc. The notorious theory of ultra-imperialism invented by Kautsky is just as reactionary. Compare his arguments on this subject in 1915 with Hobson's arguments in 1902. Kautsky: cannot the present imperialist policy be supplanted by a new ultra-imperialist policy which will introduce the joint exploitation of the world by internationally united finance capital in place of the mutual rivalries of national finance capitals? Such a new phase of capitalism is at any rate conceivable. Can it be achieved? Sufficient premises are still lacking to enable us to answer this question. Hobson: Christendom, thus laid out in a few great federal empires, each with a retinue of uncivilized dependencies, seems to many the most legitimate development of present tendencies, and one which would offer the best hope of permanent peace on an assured basis of inter-imperialism. Kautsky called ultra-imperialism or super-imperialism what Hobson, 13 years earlier, described as inter-imperialism, except for coining a new and clever catchword, replacing one Latin prefix by another. The only progress Kautsky has made in the sphere of scientific thought is that he gave out as Marxism what Hobson, in effect, described as the cant of English parsons. After the Anglo-Boer War, it was quite natural for this highly honorable caste to exert their main efforts to console the British middle class and the workers who had lost many of their relatives on the battlefields of South Africa and who were obliged to pay higher taxes in order to guarantee still higher profits for the British financiers. And what better consolation could there be other than the theory that imperialism is not so bad, that it stands close to inter or ultra-imperialism, which can ensure permanent peace? No matter what the good intentions of the English parsons, or of sentimental Kautsky, may have been, the only objective, i.e. real social significance of Kautsky's theory is this: it is a most reactionary method of consoling the masses with hopes of permanent peace being possible under capitalism. By distracting their attention from the sharp antagonisms and acute problems of the present times, and directing it towards illusory prospects of an imaginary ultra-imperialism of the future. Deception of the masses, that is all there is in Kautsky's Marxist theory. Indeed, it is enough to compare well-known and indisputable facts to become convinced of the utter falsity of the prospects which Kautsky tries to conjure up before the German workers, and the workers of all land. Let us consider India, Indochina, and China. It is known that these three colonial and semi-colonial countries, with a population of 600 to 700 million, are subjected to the exploitation of the finance capital of several imperialist countries: Great Britain, France, Japan, the USA, etc. Let us assume that these imperialist countries form alliances against one another in order to protect or enlarge their possessions, their interests, and their spheres of influence in these Asiatic states. These alliances will be inter-imperialist or ultra-imperialist alliances. Let us assume that all the imperialist countries conclude an alliance for the peaceful division of these parts of Asia. This alliance would be an alliance of internationally united finance capital. There are actual examples of alliances of this kind in the history of the 20th century. The attitude of the powers to China, for instance. We ask, is it conceivable, assuming that the capitalist system remains intact, and this is precisely the assumption that Kautsky does make, that such alliances would be more than temporary, that they would eliminate friction, conflicts, and struggle in every possible form? The question has only to be presented clearly for any other than a negative answer to be impossible. This is because the only conceivable basis under capitalism for the division of spheres of influence, interests, colonies, etc., is a calculation of the strength of those participating, their general economic, financial, military strength, etc. And the strength of these participants in the division does not change to an equal degree, for the even development of different undertakings, trusts, branches of industry, or countries is impossible under capitalism. Half a century ago was a miserable, insignificant country. If her capitalist strength is compared with that of the Britain of that time, Japan compared with Russia in the same way. Is it conceivable that in 10 or 20 years' time, the relative strength of the imperialist powers will have remained unchanged? It is out of the question. Therefore, in the realities of the capitalist system, and not in the banal Philistine fantasies of English parsons, or of the German Marxist, Kautsky, inter-imperialist or ultra-imperialist alliances, no matter what form they may assume, whether of one imperialist coalition against another, or of a general alliance embracing all the imperialist powers, are inevitably nothing more than a truce in periods between wars. Peaceful alliances prepare the grounds for wars, and in their turn grow out of wars. The one conditions the other, producing alternating forms of peaceful and non-peaceful struggle on one and the same basis for imperialist connections and relations within world economics and world politics. But in order to pacify the workers and reconcile them with the social chauvinists who have deserted to the side of the bourgeoisie, overwise Kautsky separates one link of a single chain from another, separates the present peaceful and ultra-imperialist, nay, ultra-imperialist alliance of all the powers for the pacification of China. Remember the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, from the non-peaceful conflict of tomorrow, which will prepare the ground for another peaceful general alliance for the partition, say, of Turkey on the day after tomorrow, etc., etc. Instead of showing the living connection between periods of imperialist peace and periods of imperialist war, Kautsky presents the workers with a lifeless abstraction in order to reconcile them to their lifeless leaders. An American writer, Hill, in his A History of the Diplomacy in the International Development of Europe, refers in his preface to the following periods in the recent history of diplomacy. 1. The era of revolution. 2. Constitutional movement. 3. The present era of commercial imperialism. Another writer divides the history of Great Britain's world policy since 1870 into 4 periods. 1. The first Asiatic period, that of the struggle against Russia's advance in Central Asia towards India. 2. The African period, approximately 1885 to 1902, that of the struggle against France for the partition of Africa, the Fashoda incident in 1898, which brought her within a hair's breadth of war with France. 3. The second Asiatic period alliance with Japan against Russia. And 4. The European period, chiefly anti-German. The political patrol clashes take place on the financial field, wrote the banker, Reiser, in 1905, in showing how French finance capital operating in Italy was preparing the way for a political alliance of these countries, and how a conflict was developing between Germany and Great Britain over Persia, between all the European capitalists over Chinese loans, etc. Behold the living reality of peaceful, ultra-imperialist alliances in their inseverable connection with ordinary imperialist conflicts. Kautsky's obscuring of the deepest contradictions of imperialism, which inevitably boils down to painting imperialism in bright colors, leaves its trace in this writer's criticism of the political features of imperialism. Imperialism is the epoch of finance capital and of monopolies, which introduce everywhere the striving for domination, not for freedom. Whatever the political system, the result of these tendencies is everywhere reaction and an extreme intensification of antagonisms in this field. Particularly intensified become the yoke of national oppression and the striving for annexations, i.e., the violation for national independence, for annexation is nothing but the violation of the right of nations to self-determination. Hilferding rightly notes the connection between imperialism and the intensification of national oppression. In the newly opened up countries, he writes, the capital imported into them intensifies antagonisms and excites against the intruders the constantly growing resistance of the peoples who are awakening to national consciousness. This resistance can easily develop into dangerous measures against foreign capital. The old social relations become completely revolutionized. The age-long agrarian isolation of nations without history is destroyed, and they are drawn into the capitalist whirlpool. Capitalism itself gradually provides the subjugated with the means and resources for their emancipation, and they set out to achieve the goal which once seemed highest to the European nations, the creation of a united national state as a means to economic and cultural freedom. This movement for national independence threatens European capital in its most valuable and most promising fields of exploitation, and European capital can maintain its domination only by continually increasing its military forces. To this must be added that it is not only in newly opened up countries, but also in the old, that imperialism is leading to annexation, to increased national oppression, and, consequently, also to increasing resistance. While objecting to the intensification of political reaction by imperialism, Kautsky leaves in the shade a question that has become particularly urgent, viz. The impossibility of unity with the opportunists in the epoch of imperialism. While objecting to annexations, he presents his objections in a form that is most acceptable and least offensive to the opportunists. He addresses himself to a German audience, yet he obscures the most topical and important point, for instance, the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine by Germany. In order to appraise this mental aberration of Kautsky's, I shall take the following example. Let us suppose that a Japanese condemns the annexation of the Philippines by the Americans. The question is, will many believe that he does so because he has a horror of annexations as such, and not because he himself has a desire to annex the Philippines? And shall we not be constrained to admit that the fight the Japanese is waging against annexations can be regarded as being sincere and politically honest only if he fights against the annexation of Korea by Japan and urges freedom for Korea to secede from Japan? Kautsky's theoretical analysis of imperialism, as well as his economic and political critique of imperialism, are permeated through and through with a spirit absolutely irreconcilable with Marxism, of obscuring and glossing over the fundamental contradictions of imperialism, and with a striving to preserve at all costs the crumbling unity with opportunism in the European working class movement. Chapter 10. The Place of Imperialism in History. We have seen that in its economic essence, imperialism is monopoly capitalism. This in itself determines its place in history. For monopoly that grows out of the soil of free competition, and precisely out of free competition, is the transition from the capitalist system to a higher socio-economic order. We must take special note of the four principal types of monopoly, or principal manifestations of monopoly capitalism, which are characteristic of the epoch we are examining. Firstly, monopoly arose out of the concentration of production at a very high stage. This refers to the monopolist capitalist associations, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. We have seen the important part these play in present-day economic life. At the beginning of the 20th century, monopolies had acquired complete supremacy in the advanced countries, and although the first steps towards the formation of the cartels were taken by countries enjoying the protection of high tariffs, Germany, America, Great Britain, with her system of free trade, revealed the same basic phenomenon, only a little later, namely the birth of monopoly out of the concentration of production. Secondly, monopolies have stimulated the seizure of the most important sources of raw materials, especially for the basic and most cartelized industries in capitalist society, the coal and iron industries. The monopoly of the most important sources of raw materials has enormously increased the power of big capital and has sharpened the antagonism between cartelized and non-cartelized industry. Thirdly, monopoly has sprung from the banks. The banks have developed from modest middleman enterprises into the monopolists of finance capital. Some 3 to 5 of the biggest banks in each of the foremost capitalist countries have achieved the personal link-up between industrial and bank capital, and have concentrated in their hands the control of thousands upon thousands of millions, which form the greater part of the capital and income of entire countries. A financial oligarchy, which throws a close network of dependence relationships over all the economic and political institutions of present-day bourgeois society without exception, such is the most striking manifestation of this monopoly. Fourthly, monopoly has grown out of colonial policy to the numerous old motives of colonial policy. Finance capital has added the struggle for the sources of raw materials, for the export of capital, for spheres of influence, i.e., for spheres for profitable deals, concessions, monopoly profits, and so on, economic territory in general. When the colonies of the European powers, for instance, comprised only 1/10 of the territory of Africa, as was the case in 1876, colonial policy was able to develop, by methods other than those of monopoly, by the free grabbing of territories, so to speak. But when 9/10 of Africa had been seized by 1900, when the whole world had been divided up, there was inevitably ushered in the era of monopoly possession of colonies and, consequently, of particularly intense struggle for the division and the redivision of the world. The extent to which monopolist capital has intensified all the contradictions of capitalism is generally known. It is sufficient to mention the high cost of living and the tyranny of the cartels. This intensification of contradictions constitutes the most powerful driving force of the transitional period of history, which began from the time of the final victory of world finance capital. Monopolies, oligarchy, the striving for domination and not for freedom, the exploitation of an increasing number of small or weak nations by a handful of the richest of the most powerful nations. All these have given birth to those distinctive characteristics of imperialism which compel us to define it as parasitic or decaying capitalism. More and more prominently there emerges, as one of the tendencies of imperialism, the creation of the rentier state, the usurer state, in which the bourgeoisie to an ever-increasing degree lives on the proceeds of capital exports and by clipping coupons. It would be a mistake to believe that this tendency to decay precludes the rapid growth of capitalism. It does not. In the epoch of imperialism, certain branches of industry, certain strata of the bourgeoisie, and certain countries betray, to a greater or lesser degree, now one and now another of these tendencies. On the whole, capitalism is growing far more rapidly than before, but this growth is not only becoming more and more uneven in general, its unevenness also manifests itself, in particular, in the decay of the countries which are richest in capital, Britain. In regard to the rapidity of Germany's economic development, Reiser, the author of the book on the big German banks, states, "The progress of the preceding period, 1848 to 70, which had not been exactly slow, compares with the rapidity with which the whole of Germany's national economy, and with it German banking, progressed during this period, 1870 to 1905, in about the same way as the speed of the mail coach in the good old days compares with the speed of the present-day automobile, which is whizzing past so fast that it endangers not only innocent pedestrians in its path, but also the occupants of the car." In its turn, this finance capital, which has grown with such extraordinary rapidity, is not unwilling, precisely because it has grown so quickly, to pass on to a more tranquil possession of colonies which have to be seized, and not only by peaceful methods, from richer nations. In the United States, economic development in the last decades has been even more rapid than in Germany, and for this very reason, the parasitic features of modern American capitalism have stood out with particular prominence. On the other hand, a comparison of, say, the Republican American bourgeoisie with the monarchist Japanese or German bourgeoisie shows that the most pronounced political distinction diminishes to an extreme degree in the epoch of imperialism. Not because it is unimportant in general, but because in all these cases we are talking about a bourgeoisie which has definite features of parasitism. The receipt of high monopoly profits by the capitalists in one of the numerous branches of industry, in one of the numerous countries, etc., makes it economically possible for them to bribe certain sections of the workers, and for a time a fairly considerable minority of them, and win them to the side of the bourgeoisie of a given industry or given nation against all the others. The intensification of antagonisms between imperialist nations for the division of the world increases this urge, and so there is created that bond between imperialism and opportunism, which revealed itself first and most clearly in Great Britain, owing to the fact that certain features of imperialist development were observable there much earlier than in other countries. Some writers, L. Martov, for example, are prone to wave aside the connection between imperialism and opportunism in the working class movement, a particularly glaring fact at the present time, by resorting to official optimism, a la Kautsky and Huysmans, like the following. The cause of the opponents of capitalism would be hopeless if it were progressive capitalism that led to the increase of opportunism, or if it were the best paid workers who were inclined towards opportunism, etc. We must have no illusions about optimism of this kind. It is optimism in respect of opportunism. It is optimism which serves to conceal opportunism. As a matter of fact, the extraordinary rapidity and the particularly revolting character of the development of opportunism is by no means a guarantee that its victory will be durable. The rapid growth of a painful abscess on a healthy body can only cause it to burst more quickly and thus relieve the body of it. The most dangerous of all in this respect are those who do not wish to understand that the fight against imperialism is a sham and humbug unless it is inseparably bound up with the fight against opportunism. From all that has been said in this book on the economic essence of imperialism, it follows that we must define it as capitalism in transition or, more precisely, a moribund capitalism. It is very instructive in this respect to note that bourgeois economists, in describing modern capitalism, frequently employ catchwords and phrases like interlocking, absence of isolation, etc., in conformity with their functions and course of development. Banks are not purely private business enterprises, they are more and more outgrowing the spheres of purely private business regulation. And this very Reiser, whose words I have just quoted, declares with all seriousness that the prophecy of the Marxists concerning socialization has not come true. What then does this catchword, interlocking, express? It merely expresses the most striking feature of the process going on before our eyes. It shows that the observer counts the separate trees but cannot see the woods. It slavishly copies the superficial, the fortuitous, the chaotic. It reveals the observer as one who is overwhelmed by the mass of raw material and is utterly incapable of appreciating its meaning and importance. Ownership of shares, the relations between owners of private property, interlock in a haphazard way. But underlying this interlocking, its very base, are the changing social relations of production. When a big enterprise assumes gigantic proportions and, on the basis of an exact computation of mass data, organizes according to plan the supply of primary raw materials to the extent of 2/3 or 3/4 of all that is necessary for tens of millions of people. When the raw materials are transported in a systematic and organized manner to the most suitable places of production, sometimes situated hundreds or thousands of miles from each other, when a single center directs all the consecutive stages of processing the material right up to the manufacture of numerous varieties of finished articles, when these products are distributed according to a single plan among tens and hundreds of millions of consumers, the marketing of oil in America and Germany by American Oil Trust, then it becomes evident that we have socialization of production and not mere interlocking. That private economic and private property relations constitute a shell which no longer fits its contents, a shell which must inevitably decay if its removal is artificially delayed, a shell which may remain in a state of decay for a fairly long period, if, at the worst, the cure of the opportunist abscess is protracted, but which will inevitably be removed. The enthusiastic admirer of German imperialism, Schultz Gavernitz, exclaims, "Once the supreme management of the German banks has been entrusted to the hands of a dozen persons, their activity is even today more significant for the public good than that of the majority of the minister's state." The interlocking of bankers, ministers, magnates of industry, and rentiers is here conveniently forgotten. If we imagine the development of those tendencies we have noted carried to their logical conclusion, we will have the money capital of the nation united in the banks themselves combined into cartels, the investment capital of the nation cast in the shape of securities. Then the forecast of that genius, Saint Simon, will be fulfilled. The present anarchy of production, which corresponds to the fact that economic relations are developing without uniform regulation, must make way for organization and production. Production will no longer be directed by isolated manufacturers, independent of each other and ignorant of man's economic needs. That will be done by a certain public institution, a central committee of management, being able to survey the large field of social economy from a more elevated point of view, will regulate it for the benefit of the whole of society, will put the means of production into suitable hands, and above all, will take care that there will be constant harmony between production and consumption. Institutions already exist which have assumed as part of their functions a certain organization of economic labor, the banks. We are still a long way from the fulfillment of Saint Simon's forecast, but we are on the way towards it. Marxism, different from what Marx imagined, but different only in form. A crushing refutation of Marx indeed, which retreats a step from Marx's precise scientific analysis to Saint Simon's guesswork, the guesswork of a genius, but guesswork all the same.